It was supposed to be an ordinary Monday morning at Ridgewood Middle School, but by lunchtime, the entire school was buzzing with whispers about a shocking incident in Mr. Halford's classroom. Mr. Halford, a seasoned teacher known for his strict discipline and no-nonsense attitude, had always been a polarizing figure among students. Some admired his dedication to the craft of teaching, while others thought he took his authority too far. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened that day. The day started like any other. Students shuffled into their classrooms, still groggy from the weekend, while teachers tried to corral their attention back to lessons. In Mr. Halford's science class, tensions were already running high. Rumor had it that Danny, one of the students who often tested boundaries, had been at odds with Mr. Halford for weeks. Danny was a bright kid, but he had a knack for pushing buttons, talking out of turn, cracking jokes when the teacher's back was turned, and occasionally failing to hand in homework on time. Danny wasn't just any student. He was the son of Mr. Blackwood, the school's principal. Everyone knew this, including Mr. Halford, but it didn't seem to give Danny any special treatment. If anything, it felt like Mr. Halford came down on him even harder, determined to prove that he wasn't showing favoritism. Danny, however, seemed to take it all in stride, or at least that's what he wanted everyone to think. That morning, the lesson was about chemical reactions. Mr. Halford was explaining the concept with his usual enthusiasm, scribbling formulas on the whiteboard and gesturing dramatically to keep the students engaged. Danny, sitting in the back row, wasn't paying attention. Instead, he was fiddling with something in his pencil case, a slight smirk playing on his face. Danny, Mr. Halford's voice cut through the hum of the classroom. Would you like to share with the class what's so fascinating back there? The other students turned to look, stifling giggles. Danny shrugged, holding up a harmless eraser. Just taking notes, sir. Mr. Halford wasn't buying it. He walked to the back of the room, his expression hard. Hand it over, he said. Danny hesitated, and for a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. Then, with a theatrical sigh, he handed over the eraser. The lesson resumed, but the tension lingered. Mr. Halford's patience seemed to be wearing thin, and Danny was clearly enjoying pushing his buttons. About halfway through the class, it happened. Danny, trying to be discreet, began sticking small pieces of tape to the underside of his desk. He wasn't being particularly subtle, and it didn't take long for Mr. Halford to notice. Danny! Mr. Halford's voice boomed, making the entire class jump. Stand up! Danny stood, a defiant grin on his face. What's the problem now? Mr. Halford walked over, pointing to the tape. Care to explain this? It's just tape, Danny said, shrugging. Didn't think it was a crime. The class was silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. Mr. Halford's face was a mixture of frustration and determination. If you want to waste time, Danny, fine. But you won't waste mine or your classmates. Sit down. Danny sat, but the air in the room was thick with unease. Everyone could tell Mr. Halford was struggling to keep his composure. What happened next was a blur. In what seemed like a split-second decision, Mr. Halford reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small tube of superglue. He marched over to Danny's desk, and before anyone could process what was happening, he squeezed a line of glue onto the surface. Put your hands here, Mr. Halford demanded. The class erupted into gasps and murmurs. Danny froze, his bravado faltering. You're kidding, right? I'm dead serious, Mr. Halford said, his voice low and firm. Since you can't seem to keep your hands off your desk, let's make sure they stay there. Danny hesitated, but Mr. Halford's glare left no room for argument. Slowly, Danny placed his hands on the desk, his classmates watching in stunned silence. The glue worked almost instantly. Danny tried to pull his hands away, but they wouldn't budge. You can't be serious, he exclaimed, his voice rising. I warned you, Mr. Halford said, crossing his arms. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before disrupting my class? The students were too shocked to react. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances, while others sat frozen, unsure of what to do. Danny, however, wasn't going to let this slide. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "My dad's the principal." Mr. Halford didn't flinch. "Then maybe your father will teach you the value of respect," he replied, turning his attention back to the lesson. But Danny wasn't done. He struggled against the glue, his face turning red with frustration. "You can't just do this!" he shouted. "This is insane!" The tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, one of the students raised their hand. Mr. Halford," she said hesitantly, "isn't this a little extreme?" Mr. Halford shot her a look that silenced her immediately. "Stay out of it," he said curtly. The rest of the class passed in a haze. Danny sat at his desk, his hands still glued, while Mr. Halford continued the lesson as if nothing had happened. When the bell finally rang, Danny stayed behind, his classmates filing out with a mixture of relief and apprehension. What would happen next was anyone's guess. Danny's father, Mr. Blackwood, was known for being fair but firm. How would he react when he found out what had happened? Would he side with his son, or would he support Mr. Halford's unorthodox punishment? And what about Danny? Would this incident change his behavior, or would it only fuel his rebellion? As the classroom emptied, the silence was deafening. Danny sat alone, his hands still stuck to the desk, staring at Mr. Halford with a look that promised this wasn't over. Mr. Halford, meanwhile, began erasing the whiteboard, his expression unreadable. Little did they know, the fallout from this moment would ripple far beyond the classroom walls. The staff, the students, and even the community would soon be drawn into the controversy, each side grappling with questions of discipline, authority, and respect. For now, though, all anyone could do was wait. The quiet hum of the empty classroom was broken only by the sound of Mr. Halford erasing the whiteboard. Danny, still glued to his desk, was staring daggers at him. The initial shock had worn off, leaving only a simmering rage. His mind raced with thoughts about what he would say to his father, Principal Blackwood. How could a teacher, any teacher, think they could get away with something like this? In the hallway, the usual lunchtime chatter was subdued. Word of what had happened in Mr. Halford's class had spread like wildfire. Students whispered in clusters, and even some of the teachers looked uneasy as they passed each other in the staff room. Ridgewood Middle School was no stranger to drama, but this was on a whole new level. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, Mr. Blackwood was oblivious to the chaos brewing just a few doors down. He was going over schedules for an upcoming parent-teacher meeting when his phone buzzed. It was a text from one of the school's secretaries. "You might want to check on Danny in room 204. There's been an incident." Frowning, he set down his pen. It wasn't like Danny to be involved in anything serious, at least not serious enough to warrant a message like this. Sure, his son could be a handful, but he was no troublemaker, or so Mr. Blackwood thought. Rising from his desk, he headed down the hallway, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. Back in the classroom, Mr. Halford finally turned to Danny. "This isn't as bad as you're making it out to be," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The glue will wear off in a few minutes, and you'll be fine. Consider it a lesson in respecting rules." Danny didn't respond. He was too busy glaring at him, his lips pressed into a thin line. When Mr. Blackwood entered the room moments later, he paused in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Halford," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made the teacher turn immediately. "What is going on here?" Mr. Halford hesitated for a moment, then straightened his posture. "Mr. Blackwood, I had to address a disruption in class." "Your son was—" "I can see what you've done," Mr. Blackwood interrupted, his tone sharper now. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, stopping in front of Danny. "Are your hands glued to the desk?" Danny nodded, his voice breaking as he finally spoke. He made me do it, Dad. I told him it wasn't right, but he didn't care. Mr. Blackwood's jaw tightened. He turned back to Mr. Halford, his usually calm demeanor starting to crack. You're telling me that your idea of discipline involved super glue? Do you realize how inappropriate, how dangerous that is? It was a measured response, Mr. Halford began, but the principal cut him off with a glare that silenced him. Get the solvent, Mr. Blackwood ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mr. Halford hesitated for a moment, then moved to his desk to retrieve a small bottle of glue remover. He returned to the desk, carefully applying the solution to free Danny's hands. The room was thick with tension as Mr. Blackwood watched, his expression unreadable. Once Danny was free, he stood up, rubbing his hands and shooting another angry look at Mr. Halford. You're in so much trouble, he muttered under his breath, but his father's stern glance silenced him. Danny, wait in my office, Mr. Blackwood said firmly. But Dad, now. Reluctantly, Danny left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Once he was gone, Mr. Blackwood turned back to Mr. Halford. I've worked with you for years, he said quietly, and I've respected your teaching methods, even when they've been stricter than most. But this crosses a line. I was trying to make a point, Mr. Halford replied, his voice defensive. Danny has been disruptive for weeks. I've spoken to him, I've sent him to detention, and nothing seems to work. He needs to understand there are consequences for his actions. There's a difference between discipline and humiliation, Mr. Blackwood shot back. What you did today was not only unprofessional, it was completely unacceptable. We'll discuss this further in my office after school. Mr. Halford nodded stiffly, his face set in a grim expression. Without another word, Mr. Blackwood left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. As the day wore on, the incident became the talk of the school. Students speculated about what would happen to Mr. Halford, while teachers debated whether his actions were justifiable. Some argued that Danny had been asking for it, while others were horrified by the use of such an extreme measure. In the principal's office, Danny sat across from his father, his arms crossed. You're not actually going to take his side, are you? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. This isn't about sides, Mr. Blackwood said, leaning forward in his chair. It's about figuring out what went wrong and how to fix it. I want to hear your side of the story, but I also need you to be honest with me. Did you do something to provoke him? Danny hesitated, then shrugged. I mean, I wasn't doing anything that bad. Just messing around a little. It's not like I deserved to be glued to my desk. No, you didn't, Mr. Blackwood agreed. But you also need to understand that your behavior in class matters. This situation never should have escalated the way it did. Danny didn't reply, but his expression softened slightly. He knew his father was right, even if he didn't want to admit it. By the time the final bell rang, the tension in the school was palpable. Parents had already started to hear rumors, and some had even called the front office demanding answers. Mr. Blackwood knew he would have to address the situation sooner rather than later, but for now, he focused on handling things internally. When Mr. Halford entered the office later that afternoon, he looked tired but defiant. I understand the optics of this aren't great, he began, but I stand by my decision. Danny needed a wake-up call. And what about the other students in your class? Mr. Blackwood countered. Do you think they were focused on learning after witnessing something like that? Mr. Halford didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the floor. This isn't just about Danny, Mr. Blackwood continued. It's about the trust parents place in us to create a safe, supportive environment for their children. Today you broke that trust. I didn't mean to, Mr. Halford said quietly. I know, Mr. Blackwood replied. But intent doesn't change the impact. I'll need to report this to the school board, and until they've reviewed the situation, you're suspended. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mr. Halford nodded, his face pale. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As Mr. Halford left the office, Mr. Blackwood sighed, rubbing his temples. This was far from over. The next steps would involve meetings, reports, and no doubt plenty of backlash from parents and staff alike. But more than that, it would force him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his son, his staff, and the culture of discipline at Ridgewood Middle School. Danny, meanwhile, was sitting at home, replaying the day's events in his mind. He knew his father had his back, but he also knew he wasn't entirely innocent. The thought gnawed at him, leaving him restless and uneasy. And somewhere in town, one of the parents who had heard about the incident was already drafting an email to the local news station. Ridgewood Middle School was about to find itself in the spotlight, and not in a way anyone wanted. That evening, the school was eerily quiet as Principal Blackwood sat in his office, staring at the blank document on his computer screen. He was supposed to be drafting the report for the school board, but the weight of the situation made it nearly impossible to focus. The image of Danny glued to his desk, his face flushed with humiliation, replayed in his mind like a bad dream. How had it come to this? He prided himself on running a school where teachers and students respected each other, yet today had shattered that belief. At home, Danny paced his bedroom, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from classmates, all eager to know what would happen to Mr. Halford. Danny didn't reply. He wasn't sure what to say. Part of him felt vindicated. Mr. Halford deserved to face consequences, but another part felt guilty. Had he really been pushing too far in class? Was this whole thing, at least in some small way, his fault? Downstairs, his mom and dad were talking in hushed voices. Danny strained to hear them, but the only words he caught were school board, media, and serious trouble. The knot in his stomach tightened. He wasn't used to seeing his dad so stressed, and it scared him. What if this incident hurt his dad's reputation? What if it hurt their family? The next morning, the first news van arrived just as the sun peeked over the horizon. A reporter, dressed in a sharp suit, stood in front of the school gates, microphone in hand. By the time students began to arrive, there were 3 more vans, each with cameras aimed at Ridgewood Middle School's entrance. Parents hurried their kids past the reporters, their faces etched with worry. Inside, the tension was unbearable. Teachers spoke in whispers, their eyes darting toward the principal's office. Students were buzzing with excitement and nerves, their phones out, recording the scene as the reporters lingered outside. Danny walked through the hallways with his hood up, trying to avoid the stares. He felt like every pair of eyes was on him, judging him, blaming him for the chaos. In the staff room, Mr. Halford sat at a corner table, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet unease. His suspension had been announced in a staff meeting that morning, but he had been allowed to come in to pack up his things. As he slipped his belongings into a worn leather bag, he couldn't help but feel the sting of judgment from his colleagues.
He had always believed in tough love, in teaching students the value of discipline and respect. But now, his methods had left him isolated, his career hanging by a thread. The school board meeting was set for the evening, and the hours leading up to it felt like an eternity. Principal Blackwood spent the day fielding calls from concerned parents and trying to maintain order in a school that felt on the verge of chaos. He knew that tonight's meeting would be a turning point, not just for Mr. Halford, but for Ridgewood Middle School as a whole. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the building grew thicker. Danny couldn't concentrate in class. Every time he glanced at the clock, it seemed to move slower. He couldn't stop thinking about the meeting, about what would happen to Mr. Halford, and about his own role in everything. Was he ready to speak up if the board asked for his side of the story? Could he face the weight of the truth? When the final bell rang, Danny stayed behind in his classroom, staring out the window at the gathering crowd outside. Parents, reporters, and even a few curious community members were assembling near the school board office, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. At home, Danny's parents were getting ready to attend the meeting. His mom was unusually quiet, her lips pressed into a thin line as she grabbed her coat. His dad looked exhausted, his tie slightly askew as he checked his phone for the 100th time. "Danny, are you sure you want to come?" his dad asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Yes," Danny replied without hesitation. "I need to be there." The ride to the school board office was silent. Danny stared out the window, his mind racing. He imagined what the meeting would be like, the questions, the accusations, the tension. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he couldn't avoid it. This was bigger than him now. When they arrived, the parking lot was packed. Camera crews lined the walkway, their bright lights cutting through the dim evening. Danny felt his stomach twist as he walked past them, his parents flanking him protectively. The boardroom was already filling up, the air thick with whispers and anticipation. Danny spotted Mr. Halford sitting at a table near the front. He looked different tonight, his usual crisp appearance slightly rumpled. His expression was a mix of defiance and defeat, as though he were bracing himself for whatever was about to come. Principal Blackwood took his seat beside the school board members, his face calm but tense. He glanced at Danny, giving him a small, reassuring nod. Danny swallowed hard, gripping the edge of his chair as the meeting began. The board chair, a stern-looking woman with sharp glasses, called the meeting to order. She started by summarizing the incident, her tone measured but firm. As she spoke, Danny felt the weight of every word settle on his chest. This wasn't just about a bad decision or a classroom prank gone wrong. This was about trust, leadership, and the responsibility of educators to protect their students. When it was Mr. Halford's turn to speak, he stood up, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His voice was steady, but there was a faint tremor underneath. He explained his actions, his frustration with Danny's behavior, and his belief that discipline was necessary for effective teaching. But as he spoke, his words seemed to falter, as though even he wasn't entirely convinced of his own defense. The room was silent when he finished. Then, the board turned to Danny. "Would you like to share your perspective?" the chair asked, her voice kind but probing. Danny hesitated, his heart pounding. He glanced at his dad, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. All eyes were on him, and for a moment, he felt like he might crumble under the pressure. I know I've been a pain in class," Danny began, his voice shaky. "I've talked back, I've joked around, and I haven't been respectful. And I'm sorry for that. But what happened? It wasn't right. No one deserves to be treated like that, no matter what." Deep down, his words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over the room. Mr. Halford looked down at his hands, his face unreadable. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. The meeting continued, each word adding to the tension in the room. By the time it ended, the air was electric with anticipation. The board's decision would be announced the next day, and everyone knew it would be a defining moment for the school. As Danny and his parents walked back to the car, the cameras followed them, their questions blending into a chaotic blur. Danny felt drained, but also strangely lighter, as though speaking his truth had lifted a weight off his shoulders. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The real consequences of what had happened were still to come, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in days, Danny felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could still turn out okay. The next morning, Danny woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. He grudgingly reached for it, squinting at the screen. Social media was exploding with posts about the meeting. Clips of his speech had been shared widely, with strangers praising his courage and calling him a voice for fairness. But mixed in with the supportive messages were others, angrier ones, questioning his motives, accusing him of being dramatic, or worse, using his father's position to sway the outcome. Danny's stomach twisted. He had thought speaking up was the hardest part, but now it felt like the aftermath might be even more challenging. At breakfast, his dad sat silently at the table, reading emails on his laptop while sipping his coffee. His mom moved around the kitchen, pretending to be calm but stealing worried glances at both of them. It was clear the tension from last night's meeting hadn't faded. Danny pushed his cereal around in the bowl, his appetite gone. Just as he was about to excuse himself, his dad's phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the uneasy quiet. Principal Blackwood answered it quickly, his voice professional. But as he listened, his expression darkened. He muttered a few clipped responses before ending the call and looking at Danny and his mom with a grave expression. "That was the district office," he said, his tone heavy. Someone leaked a private recording from the staff meeting. It's already all over the internet. Danny's heart sank. He had heard rumors that the staff meeting had been intense, with heated arguments over how the school handled discipline and fairness. But a recording? His dad ran his hands through his hair, clearly distressed. This is going to make things worse for everyone, he continued. The media's already running wild with it, and now the district launching a full investigation. The weight of the situation suddenly felt heavier. Danny's mom put a comforting hand on her husband's shoulder, but they barely seemed to notice. For the first time, Danny realized this wasn't just about him or even Mr. Halford. The entire school was under scrutiny now, and the fallout was spreading further than anyone had anticipated. When Danny arrived at school, the atmosphere was even tenser than the day before. Students whispered in groups, their eyes darting toward teachers who avoided meeting anyone's gaze. The news about the leaked recording had spread like wildfire, and speculation was rampant. Some claimed it had been a teacher trying to expose the school's problems. Others believed it was a staff member trying to protect Mr. Halford. No one knew the truth, but everyone had an opinion. Danny felt the weight of their stares as he walked through the halls. He tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept drifting back to the recording. What had been said in that meeting? What secrets had been exposed? And most importantly, who had leaked it? By lunchtime, things took an even stranger turn. As Danny sat with his tray, picking at his food, his friend Simon slid into the seat across from him, his face pale. "You're not gonna believe this," Simon said, leaning in close. "I just heard from Jenna that someone saw Mr. Halford meeting with a reporter last night. Off school grounds." Danny froze, his fork clattering onto his plate. "What? Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pretty sure," Simon replied, glancing around nervously. "Jenna said her older brother works at the cafe where they met. Said it looked intense." Danny's mind raced. Was Mr. Halford behind the recording? It didn't make sense. He had looked so shaken during the meeting. But the timing was suspicious, and the idea planted itself in Danny's head, refusing to budge. That afternoon, Principal Blackwood called an emergency assembly. The students gathered in the gym, their whispers filling the air like static. When Danny's dad stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. His usual commanding presence was overshadowed by the strain on his face. "As many of you know, a private recording from a staff meeting has been leaked to the public," he began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "This breach of trust affects everyone in our school community. The district is investigating the matter, and we ask for your patience and understanding as we navigate this difficult situation." Danny could feel the unease ripple through the crowd. His dad continued, "We encourage anyone with information about this incident to come forward. This is not the way we resolve conflicts or address concerns." As the assembly ended, Danny's thoughts were a whirlwind. The stakes were higher now, and the pressure on his family, his school, and even himself felt almost unbearable. But just as he was about to leave, something caught his eye. Across the gym, Mr. Halford stood near the exit, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met for a brief moment before Mr. Halford turned and walked out. Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Simon's words echoed in his head. What if Mr. Halford wasn't just a bystander in all of this? What if he was trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage? That evening, Danny couldn't sit still. He paced his room, his thoughts circling back to the cafe meeting. His curiosity finally got the better of him. Grabbing his phone, he texted Jenna, asking if she could confirm her brother's story. Within minutes, she replied with a voice memo. "My brother said he saw them, for sure. Mr. Halford and some guy with a fancy camera bag. They were talking for a long time, and Mr. Halford looked, I don't know, desperate. He didn't stay for coffee, though. Just left right after." Danny's hands tightened around his phone. The pieces were starting to come together, but they still didn't have the full picture. Why would Mr. Halford meet with a reporter? And what did it have to do with the recording? The suspense was unbearable, and Danny knew he couldn't keep this to himself. The stakes were higher than ever, and the truth felt just out of reach. But one thing was clear, this was far from over. The next morning, Danny woke up feeling a strange mix of determination and dread. He hadn't been able to sleep after Jenna's message. The idea that Mr. Halford might be involved in something bigger, something calculated, had taken root in his mind. He couldn't let it go. If Mr. Halford really was behind the recording, It could change everything, not just for Danny, but for the entire school. When Danny arrived at Ridgewood Middle, the tension in the air was thicker than ever. The house was set with new rumors. Some students said the district was on the verge of shutting the school down. Others whispered that the board was considering firing not just Mr. Halford, but several other staff members too. Danny's chest tightened at the thought. He didn't want the school to fall apart, and he didn't want innocent people to get caught in the crossfire. After lunch, Danny made a decision. He was going to confront Mr. Halford. He couldn't sit back and wait for someone else to solve this. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Danny waited until the last bell rang before heading to the teacher's lounge. He knew Mr. Halford often stayed late to grade papers, even during his suspension. Sure enough, through the small window in the door, Danny saw him sitting at a table, a stack of papers in front of him but his attention fixed on his phone. Danny hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Mr. Halford looked up, startled. His usual stern expression flickered into something softer, but only for a moment. Danny, Mr. Halford said, his voice courteous. What are you doing here? Danny stepped closer, his heart pounding. I need to know the truth, he said. Were you the one who leaked the recording? Mr. Halford's face hardened. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. That's a serious accusation, he said. You shouldn't be making it without proof. I don't have proof, Danny admitted. But I know you met with a reporter the night of the meeting. Why would you do that if you weren't trying to stir things up? Mr. Halford's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a sigh, he sat back down. You're right, he said quietly. I did meet with a reporter. But not for the reason you think. Danny's stomach twisted. Then why? He asked. Mr. Halford leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the empty lounge as if checking for eavesdroppers. Because I knew this was coming, he said. The board has been looking for a reason to cut costs, and targeting teachers like me, old school, strict, is an easy way to do it. I wanted to make sure my side of the story was told before they could spin it. Danny frowned. So you didn't leak the recording? No, Mr. Halford said firmly. But I know who did. Danny's breath caught. Who? Mr. Halford hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. It was Miss Carter. Danny's eyes widened. Miss Carter was one of the most well-liked teachers at Ridgewood, known for her kind demeanor and creative teaching methods. She had been one of the few staff members to openly criticize Mr. Halford's actions, but Danny never would have guessed she'd go so far as to leak a private recording. Why would she do that? Danny asked, struggling to process the revelation. Mr. Halford shrugged. She probably thought she was doing the right thing. She's always been idealistic, always believed in transparency. But she didn't think about the consequences. Danny's mind raced. If Miss Carter really was behind the leak, it meant she had put the entire school at risk, not out of malice, but out of a misguided sense of justice. He wasn't sure what to do with this information, but he knew he couldn't keep it to himself. That evening, the school board held another meeting, this time to announce their decision. The room was packed, the tension almost unbearable. Danny sat between his parents, his palms sweaty as he waited for the announcement. The board chair finally stood, her expression grim. After careful consideration, we have decided to terminate Mr. Halford's employment at Ridgewood Middle School, she said. While we recognize his years of service, his actions were in clear violation of our code of conduct. The room erupted into murmurs. Some people looked relieved, others outraged. Danny felt a pang of guilt. He didn't agree with everything Mr. Halford had done, but he hadn't wanted him to lose his job either. The chair raised her hand for silence. Furthermore, she continued, we are launching an internal review to address the recent leak of a private staff meeting. We have reason to believe this breach was not the act of a student, but a member of our faculty. Once the investigation is complete, we will take appropriate action. Danny glanced at Miss Carter, who sat near the back of the room. Her face was pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She avoided his gaze, but he could see the guilt written all over her. As the meeting ended and people began to file out, Danny approached Miss Carter. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and sadness. You did it, didn't you? Danny asked softly. Miss Carter nodded, her voice barely a whisper.
Thought it would help, she said. I thought if people knew what was really going on, It would force change. But I didn't think it would get this out of hand. Danny didn't know what to say. He felt angry, but also sad. Ms. Carter had meant well, but her actions had caused so much chaos. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were no real winners in this situation. The next day, life at Ridgewood Middle began to return to a strange kind of normal. The media frenzy died down, and the students and staff tried to move forward. But the scars of the incident lingered, a reminder of how easily things could spiral out of control. Danny sat in his usual spot at lunch, staring out the window. He still wasn't sure what to make of everything that had happened. But one thing was clear: he had learned more about people, and about himself, than he ever had in any classroom. And in a way, that lesson felt more valuable than anything he could have imagined. In the days following the school board meeting, the dust slowly began to settle at Ridgewood Middle. The whispers in the hallways grew quieter, the tension in the air began to thin, and the routines of school life started to re-establish themselves. But for Danny, it wasn't so easy to move on. The events of the past weeks had left him with more questions than answers and a lingering feeling of unease. Ms. Carter resigned quietly the following Monday. There was no big announcement, just a short email sent to the staff and students, thanking them for her time at Ridgewood and wishing everyone the best. The news spread quickly, leaving many shocked and saddened. For most students, Ms. Carter had been a favorite teacher, someone who inspired creativity and encouraged kindness. Her departure felt like a loss that hit the school in a deeply personal way. Danny couldn't help but feel conflicted. He remembered how many times Ms. Carter had made her classroom a safe haven for students who felt misunderstood or overwhelmed. Her intentions in leaking the recording had clearly been rooted in a desire to do good, but the consequences had spiraled out of control. Even now, Danny didn't know if she had made the right choice or the wrong one. Maybe it was both. One afternoon, Danny found himself back in his dad's office after school. Principal Blackwood looked tired but lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Papers were stacked high on his desk, and his computer screen glowed with emails and spreadsheets, but for the first time in weeks, there was a small, genuine smile on his face. "You holding up okay, kiddo?" his dad asked, looking up from his work. Danny nodded. "I think so. It's just a lot, you know?" His dad leaned back in his chair, considering him carefully. "It is a lot," he admitted. "What happened here wasn't easy for anyone. But sometimes, facing hard truths is the only way to grow." Danny sat down across from him, picking at a loose thread on his backpack strap. "Do you think what Ms. Carter did was wrong?" he asked. His dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "I think Ms. Carter believed she was doing the right thing," he said. "But good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. What matters is how we take responsibility for our actions and learn from them." Danny thought about that for a long time. His dad's words didn't make everything clear, but they gave him a way to frame the situation. People weren't perfect, and neither were their decisions. The best anyone could do was try to make things right when they went wrong. As the weeks turned into months, the school slowly began to rebuild. New teachers were hired to fill the gaps left by Ms. Carter and Mr. Halford. The district implemented stricter policies to ensure better communication and accountability among staff. For the first time in a long while, the faculty and students felt like they were working toward the same goals. Danny threw himself into his classes and extracurriculars, trying to find a sense of normalcy again. He still caught snippets of conversation about what happened, but the drama no longer felt as all-consuming as it once had. People were moving on, and so was he. One afternoon, as Danny was walking to his locker, he saw Simon waiting for him with a grin on his face. "Guess what?" Simon said, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "What?" Danny asked, chuckling at his friend's excitement. "They're starting a student council," Simon said. "And I think you should run for president." Danny blinked, taken aback. "Me? Why?" Are you kidding? Simon said, slapping him on the back. After everything you did standing up in that meeting, speaking out for what's right, you'd be perfect. People look up to you, Danny. You could really make a difference. Danny felt a flush of embarrassment, but also a small flicker of pride. He hadn't thought of himself as a leader before, but maybe Simon was right. Maybe he could use what he'd learned to help make Ridgewood a better place. I'll think about it, Danny said with a small smile, and Simon nodded approvingly. Later that evening, as Danny sat at his desk, he opened his notebook and started jotting down ideas for the student council. He thought about the changes he wanted to see, the ways he could help create a stronger sense of community at Ridgewood. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The next morning, Danny stood at the front of his history class, presenting his project on resilience. As he spoke, he saw his classmates nodding along, their expressions thoughtful. When he finished, his teacher gave him a warm smile. "That was excellent, Danny," she said. "You have a way of bringing people together." Her words stayed with him as he walked through the halls, the familiar rhythm of the school day carrying him forward. Ridgewood still had its challenges, but it was also full of people who cared, students, teachers, and staff who wanted to make things better. Danny realized that, in a way, everyone at the school was learning and growing together. As he headed home that afternoon, Danny felt a quiet sense of closure. The events of the past months had tested him in ways he never expected, but they had also shown him the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew he was ready to face them. Ridgewood Middle wasn't just a school, it was a community. And like any community, it was messy and imperfect, full of mistakes and misunderstandings. But it was also full of potential. And as Danny looked out at the fading sunlight, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned and the people who had helped him along the way. The story wasn't just about what had happened with Mr. Halford, Ms. Carter, or the school board. It was about resilience, accountability, and the courage to keep moving forward. And for Danny, that was a story worth remembering,